Okay, so right, this is Economics 1001, Fall 2021 for CPS. We're going to prepare for the final exam. And so the final exam is here. There's 40 questions. There's 20 true false questions and 20 multiple choice questions. So I'm going to go through this in the Socratic method. I'm going to formulate the questions, but I don't want you to answer them. It's just a way for you to think about what the ideas are. So the first question on all my exams is always about Sowell's rule. What is Sowell's rule? How does Sowell's rule relate to balancing the budget? What is, and I'm just choosing these randomly, what is the natural rate of interest? What is Hayek's explanation for the business cycle? What is Hayek's, or the Austrian school, monetary explanation of the business cycle? And how does that relate to the natural rate of interest? What is rent seeking? We've talked about rent seeking quite a bit. How does rent seeking relate to the rule of law? And how does rent seeking relate to vested interests? What are anti-gouging price laws? How do anti-gouging price laws relate to shortages along the stages of production? What is the mechanism by which the government raises money to spend if it doesn't tax enough? In other words, what is deficit spending? What is a US government bond? Also, how do US government bonds play into monetary policy? In other words, as reserves, what does the central bank do with buying and selling government bonds to affect monetary policy? What's the relationship between government bonds and monetary policy? What's the relationship between government bonds and fiscal policy? What is creative destruction? What is creative destruction and why is it helpful? We looked at agency capture theory, especially relating to the bond ratings. How did agency capture related to bond rating agencies, how did that contribute to the financial crisis of the housing boom and bust? In other words, what is regulatory capture? How does it relate to the bond rating agencies? And how do mortgage-backed bond ratings relate to the housing boom and bust? We talked about why the state might want to see people indebted. Why might the state want to see students indebted? What happens to tuition when the state subsidizes college tuition through loan programs? What happens to tuition? What happens to the value of a college degree when the state subsidizes the demand for higher education? We looked at fiscal and monetary policy, especially related to lag times. Lag times, see that, lag times. What are some of the lag times in fiscal policy? And what are some of the lag times in implementing monetary policy? And you can look at that again in my our Hardfire TV show, What is the Problem with Macroeconomics? In that Hardfire show, The Problem with Macroeconomics, we talk about the lag times involved. We also in that talk about pushing on a string. What is pushing on a string related to monetary policy. What is the Phillips curve? The Phillips curve is about which variables. Some examples are inflation, money supply, unemployment, government spending, and economic growth. What is the Phillips curve? What is traded off in the Phillips curve? And the Phillips curve, again, is the foundation for macroeconomic policy making. We looked at crowding out. What does crowding out mean? Here's the word, crowding out. What does crowding out mean? We talked about why is monetary policy regressive? Why is active monetary policy regressive? I'm going to share my screen for a second. So here in my projects page, here's the two encyclopedia entries, Encyclopedia Financial Crises. Here is the Austrian School monetary explanation for the business cycle, and here's the inequality created by active monetary policy. So that'll help explain, if you need a review, why is monetary policy regressive? What do we talk about when we say easy money? What's the relationship between easy money and the natural rate of interest? We looked at how the state might improve upon market outcomes. What is economic freedom? What are some of the indicators of economic freedom? What is the importance of the rule of law in commercial societies? This comes from Adam Smith when we looked at negative rights and positive rights rule of law. Why is negative rights rule of law orientation important for savings and investment and long-term investment? So again, what is economic freedom? So you should be able to give some examples of what rent seeking is, seeking special treatment under the law. We also looked at the sources and uses of funds. What are some of the tax revenue sources at the local and federal levels? And what are these tax revenue sources supposed to be used for under economic theory? Again, the point here is public goods and positive and negative spillovers. What are some of the sources and uses of revenues at the local and federal levels? Why does a sales tax lead to a deadweight loss? What is the deadweight loss due to government intervention when you're looking at surplus lost? So you should be able to understand what is the deadweight loss due to government intervention related to consumer and producer surplus. Oh yeah, we had a section today on outsourcing. When you, so protectionism is when you prevent, or we had a section today on comparative advantage. When you don't allow free trade, that's called protectionism. So who gains and who loses from protectionism in trade policy? Again, who gains and who loses through protectionism in trade policy? How does that relate to what is seen and what is unseen? We talked quite a bit about the Hayekian knowledge problem. What is the Hayekian knowledge problem? And we looked at price controls and then regulatory capture. How does the knowledge problem relate to regulatory capture? And how does the knowledge problem relate to social crises caused by price controls? What is the National Bureau for Economic Research? What is the National Bureau for Economic Research? And how does that relate to lag times in macroeconomic policy making? How does the NBER relate to lag times in macroeconomic policy making? If a central bank wants to increase the money supply and lower the interest rate, what would the central bank do? And what mechanisms does the central bank use to create monetary policy? Who gains and who loses through trade barriers? It's a transfer of surplus from whom to whom, right? We looked at the solar panel example, for example. Who gains and who loses when there's protectionism? What is subjective utility? And how does subjective utility relate to the concept of consumer sovereignty versus experts decide? What's the relationship between subjective utility, experts decide, and consumer sovereignty? We looked at the labor force participation rate. What is the labor force participation rate today compared to 2 years ago, compared to prior to the housing boom and bust? What has been happening to the labor force participation rate as we keep getting more and more state intervention over the last 15 years? What is catallaxy? What is catalactic exchange? Why is inflation in the higher education market and inflation in the healthcare market 3 times the rates of the rest of the economy? What is causing so much inflation in the healthcare and higher education markets? We looked at the differing views of prudent or sound or sustainable macroeconomic policymaking over time, from post-World War II through today. What do classical liberals believe is sound or solid macroeconomic policy? And there's a lecture, a teaching module on that on my teaching page called Changing Views of Sound Macroeconomics. What do classical liberals believe, or Hayekians believe, is sound macroeconomics? What's Kreuger's main point? What's Kreuger's main point in her 1974 paper, The Political Economy of the Rent-Seeking Society? What's Anne Kruger's main points in that paper? We looked at public goods and private goods, and we came up with a category called collective goods. What are collective goods, and how do they differ from private goods? Again, what is agency capture theory, and how does that relate to the Hayekian knowledge problem? Almost done. We looked at the book Captured Economy by Lindsay and Tellis, 2017. Is the economy now more or less captured than it was 15 years ago? Why is the economy becoming less or more captured than 15 years ago? Okay, we looked at the New York Fed Reserve Bank report of January 2021, where we looked at how monetary policy is regressive. In other words, why does active monetary policy, or why does easy money help the wealthy and hurt those less better off? In other words, how does active monetary policy help those with more disposable income? And why does active monetary policy hurt those with less disposable income. And we looked at that through the Federal Reserve Bank January 2021 report, which is available on my website. We looked at the classical equation of exchange. We looked at the classical equation of exchange. Money supply times the volume is equal to price times the quantity. This being the money side of the economy, this being the real side of the economy. What is the difference between the Chicago view or the monetarist view, the Austrian view, and the Keynesian view on the relationship between the money supply and the real economy? Looked at Fisher effects. What are Fisher effects? And how can Fisher effects help explain international capital flows? And again, there's teaching modules on all of this stuff, right? So how can Fisher effects help us explain international capital flows? So that's it. I'm going to stop recording. Stop.